All right, this video is going to go through how we can interpret the slope and the y-intercept of a regression line, or if you remember for a regression line, we also called that a line of best fit. So it's a line that best models the data in a scatter plot. And so a lot of times you're going to be asked to interpret the slope and the y-intercept of that line, and we need you to do it in a specific way. So that's what we're going to talk about in this video. So the big idea is that we can use the slope and the y-intercept of our regression line to give us really important information about our data. So the slope, if you remember that, we think of slope as either the rise over the run, and a lot of times we'll talk about that when we're looking at a graph, or we can think of it as the change in our y variable over the change in our x variable. And that's something we've talked a lot about this semester. In the context of the problem, the slope tells us how an increase in the x variable is predicted to affect the y variable, and we'll practice writing those sentences in a little bit. Now, the other thing you're going to have to be able to interpret is the y-intercept, and that's the point where the line crosses the y-axis. So in other words, if this were my x and y axis and this were my line, this point that I'm going to draw in purple here would be our y-intercept. Now, at the y-intercept, we know the y-intercept always has an x-coordinate of 0, and that's going to be important in a minute here. Now, the y-intercept tells us the predicted value of the y variable when the x variable is 0. So that's really what you need to know. Now we're going to practice and give you some frames for writing these interpretations. Sorry, my pen is running out here. All right, so we have a problem here. It says Jaron gave a survey to his classmates asking them how many hours they spent playing sports in the past day. He also asked them to rate their mood on a scale from 0 to 10, with 10 being the happiest. Then Jaron created the following scatter plot and regression line. So all these data points are data points in our scatter plot, and if you remember, that regression line is the line that best goes through those points. So the first question here says use the graph to find the slope of the regression line. So here it might be hard to see kind of on your copy or if you're looking at the screen, but we're going to use this point here, and we're calling that point, that's our y-intercept, it's 0, 5. And then as I'm looking, I see, I'm going to add a point here, which is 2, 8. So those are two nice points we're going to use to find our slope. So I'm going to use a table to do that. And I'm going to plug in 0, 5, and 2, 8. So now my change in y is going to be plus 3. My change in x is plus 2. So now my slope, we said, is the change in y, which in our case is 3, over the change in x, which is 2. So that's the slope is 3 over 2. So now this is a question we're going to be asked to do a lot. The second part says here to interpret the slope. So here's a sentence frame for how we're going to do that. So whenever we're asked to interpret the slope, it's going to go something like this. It says every time the x variable. Well, in this case, our x variable is the hours playing sports. So every time the hours playing, and I'm sorry, this line is so short. Every time the hours playing sports increases by, well, we said rise over run, so increases by the bottom number, which is 2. So every time the hours playing sports increases by 2, the y variable, in this case, that's our mood rating. The mood rating is predicted to, well, in this case, our rise was a positive 3, so we'd say it's predicted to increase by 3. And that's how we'll interpret the slope. And we'll use that general structure every time we're asked to interpret the slope. Now the next part has to do with the y-intercept. So it says use a graph to find the y-intercept of the regression line. Well, we already did that. That's the point where it crosses the y-axis. So we're going to call that point 0, 5. So now the other question we're going to be asked a lot is to interpret the y-intercept. And here's how that goes. It says when the x variable is 0. Again, our x variable is the hours playing sports. So when the hours playing sports is 0, we predict the y variable, the mood rating, is, and then we take our y-intercept, which is 5. So again, we're going to use this same structure over and over again every time we're asked to interpret the slope or the y-intercept. So let's go ahead and do a few practice problems. So number 2 says the scatter plot to the right shows the number of years since 1995 and the size of the gray wolf population in Wisconsin. The equation for the regression line is right here. All right, so now it says interpret the value 35.5, which represents the rate of change or slope of the equation. So they're asking us to interpret the slope. So I'm going to go back to here, and we're going to use this sentence frame. Maybe I'll put this here, so hopefully we could see both. So interpreting the slope, we start with every time the x variable. So here it would be every time our x variable is years since 1995, increases by, now here's where I have to think about this. My slope here is 35.5. I want to think about that as rise over run, so I want a fraction. So I'm going to make that 35.5 over 1. So that tells me every time the x variable, the year since 1995, increases by our run, in our case it's 1, so increases by 1, then it says the y variable is predicted to, in our case the y value is the population. So the gray wolf population is predicted to, now I have to decide if it's increase or decrease. Well, if I look at my top number, it's positive, so that means it's predicted to increase. We can also see that here because the slope is positive. So it's predicted to increase by, and our number there, our value is 35.5. So we're using that same sentence structure. It's really important that you get familiar with that. Now, the next part is asking us to interpret the value 104, which represents the y-intercept. So they're asking us to interpret the y-intercept. So that was our second sentence down here. So that starts off like this. When our x variable is 0, so when the years since 1995 is 0, we predict the y variable is, and then give the value. So we predict the gray wolf population is, and our value here was 104. All right, we've got one last example here, and then you'll do some practice to make sure you've got this pretty well before we talk about the retake. All right, so data was collected for 100 flights on the distance traveled during the flight and the cost of the flight. So the following regression line was found where y is the cost of the flight and x is the distance traveled during the flight. So the first thing we're being asked here is to interpret the slope. Now, I need to know when I'm looking at my equation, the slope is the number that goes with the x. So our slope in this case is 0.08. So I'm going to make a note for myself. My slope is 0.08. I can make that a fraction by putting it over 1. I know my y variable is on the top, so that's the cost, and x is the distance traveled. So that's going to help me put together my interpretation. So this is just going to be like part A. I'm going to start it off the same. So my interpretation is going to look like this. Every time we start with the x variable. So every time the distance traveled, and we always talk about what happens when the x variable increases. So every time the distance traveled increases by, well, I have 1 on the bottom, so increases by 1. Then I say the y variable, the cost of the flight, is predicted to, since my top number is positive, I know it's predicted to increase. And then I just say by that number on top by 0.08. Last thing is to interpret the y-intercept. I know the y-intercept is this number here, 177.21. And again, I'm going to use that same structure. So my sentence starts when the x variable, again, distance traveled, and with the y-intercept, we always say when the x variable is 0. When the distance traveled is 0, we predict the y variable, the cost of the flight, is, and then we put in that y-intercept, 177.21. So that's how we interpret slope and y-intercept in context. It's really about being able to put these sentences together. So following this video, I'm going to send you 4 practice problems for you to try. I want you to try those, and then we can talk about any questions you have as you work through them. All right, thank you.